Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Future of Energy series, our monthly webinar presented by the Institute for Science and Policy and the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. We're delighted to have you with us again today. And thank you for weighing in the chat and letting us know where you're viewing from. It really is terrific to see all the representation from around the Rocky Mountain region. I saw some Nebraska folks joining us, Wyoming, and of course, all of our communities here in Colorado. So thank you for spending part of your afternoon with us. I'm Trent Noss. I'm the managing editor at the Institute, and we are on episode 7 already of this incredible series that we've been running and diving into different areas of energy policy, things happening that are going to affect the energy transition in Colorado and the nation as a whole. We have a great topic ahead today: nuclear power. It is a polarizing one. It evokes a lot of strong reactions from folks who, it's tough not to think about nuclear and some of its long history. We, of course, know that it's an area that has been marred by some high-profile disasters in the past that we can all recite firsthand: Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island, Fukushima, which, of course, was 10 years ago this month. And then there are other concerns around cost, around the life cycle of materials, from the mining of raw radioactive materials all the way through to waste disposal. And yet, nuclear has incredible clean energy potential. And given the speed at which we need to act to decarbonize the economy, nuclear could potentially be part of that solution. So I'm just delighted today to be joined by Dr. Jessica Lovering. She is the co-founder of the Good Energy Collective, which is a new organization working on progressive nuclear policy. She recently completed her PhD in engineering and public policy at Carnegie Mellon University, and her dissertation focused on how commercial nuclear trade affects international security standards and how small nuclear reactors could be deployed at the community level. She's a fellow with the Energy for Growth Hub, looking at how advanced nuclear could be deployed in sub-Saharan Africa. And she was formerly the director of the energy program at Breakthrough Institute, where she worked on policies to spur innovation in nuclear power technologies to drive down costs and accelerate deployment as part of a solution to climate change and economic development. She has a bachelor's degree in astrophysics from the University of California, Berkeley, and a master's degree in energy policy from right here at the University of Colorado. So I'm just delighted to have Dr. Lovering with us today. I will leave it to you. Take it away.
All right, thank you so much. And thank you to the Institute for Science and Policy for having me. I'm going to give some brief opening remarks just to set the stage for our conversation. And to start, I wanted to talk about why nuclear energy matters for mitigating climate change. And I thought I could tell that story through my own personal journey of getting interested in nuclear, which actually did start in Colorado. So many years ago, I was doing a master's degree at CU Boulder in environmental studies, specifically in the policy track. And my main motivator was climate change, like I'm sure resonates with a lot of you. And in one of my very first classes, we did this simple exercise where we were given a country and we had to show how they would decarbonize. I think the target was like 80% greenhouse gas reductions in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And we had to make a plan for what the country would do. And I quickly realized what a huge challenge that was. Even with the rapid growth of renewable energy and declines in cost in renewable energy, it's just a very large problem. So I got interested in clean energy policy, and I ended up completing this energy certificate at CU. But I also noticed something else in this process, which was most of the countries we were looking at that had lower emissions or had reduced their carbon intensity significantly over a few decades had done so with nuclear energy. And that was just something that we didn't really talk about in any of my classes, and I didn't really know much about at the time. So I decided to focus on nuclear for the rest of my studies, not because I thought it was some, silver bullet or the best solution, but I wanted to understand its role in the bigger climate change strategy and also understand the challenges of the technology and its deployment. So in 2019, nuclear power was the second largest source of clean electricity globally after hydroelectric. It produces about 10% of the world's electricity, and in many countries, it's the largest source of clean energy. So, for example, 72% of electricity in France is from nuclear, 39% in Sweden, 25% in South Korea, and about 20% in the US and Russia. And it isn't just for wealthy countries. Nuclear power provides 12% of electricity in South Africa, and 5% in China, and 3% in Brazil and India. Now, most of these reactors were built a long time ago, but the reason that we're interested in nuclear today is mainly that it's a large scale, always on source of electricity that happens to also not emit any greenhouse gases. So that's a big plus. But back when these fleets of nuclear power plants were built in North America and Europe, climate change wasn't the main motivator. It wasn't so much of a concern. The big driver was energy security. So to explain that, I want to give a quick explainer on how nuclear works for those of you who aren't as familiar with the technology. And for those of you that are, I'm sorry, but it's helpful to have this background. So we say that a nuclear reactor burns uranium fuel, but it doesn't really burn fuel in the traditional sense like wood or coal or fossil gas. So in a nuclear reactor or any nuclear reaction, well, a fission reaction, I'll caveat, heavy atoms like uranium are split into two, and this process, this fission process, releases a lot of energy. Now, in a power plant, that energy is used to boil water, which is actually very similar to a coal plant on that side. That's how the electricity actually gets made. But because this fission process releases so much energy, the energy density of nuclear fuel is millions of times greater than, say, wood or fossil fuels, which rely on chemical combustion. So this aspect, this fuel density, made nuclear really attractive to rapidly growing economies of the post-World War II era. For example, with a nuclear power plant, you need to deliver fuel or refuel about every 18 months, rather than a coal plant, which consumes several rail cars of fuel every hour. So even if you have to import your uranium, which most countries do, you still have relative energy security. So this made nuclear very popular with countries that lack domestic fossil fuel reserves or were islands like the UK and Japan. Um, and places like that. So in the US, which was one of the sort of first countries to really use commercial nuclear power and still has the largest fleet of nuclear power plants, nuclear still provides over half of our low carbon electricity, even though we've only had one new reactor come online in the last 25 years. But we know that to meet these deep decarbonization targets that we're aiming for to really mitigate the worst effects of climate change, we need to expand clean energy significantly. And nuclear has unfortunately stagnated in the last few decades, both in the US and Western Europe. And it's not growing fast enough to meet these aggressive targets in the rest of the world. So what are the big challenges of nuclear? I'm sure you can think of a lot, but I'm going to touch on a few of them. So the main challenge for nuclear in terms of commercial deployment is really cost. And although nuclear provides cheap electricity in the long run, it has very high upfront capital costs. It's a lot like hydroelectric in that sense. But this made nuclear very difficult to build when countries, particularly when countries started deregulating their power sectors, when you didn't have these vertically integrated utilities that could finance large infrastructure projects like a nuclear power plant. Most nuclear power plants today, each reactor is over a gigawatt. That's huge. That powers millions of households. So some other challenges are dealing with the spent fuel. So this sort of challenge opportunity of nuclear is that when you refuel it, the fuel you take out actually still has about 96% of the usable energy left in it, but you can't use it in the reactor in its current form. So you have this, what we call spent fuel. You'll often hear it referred to as nuclear waste as well. And there's lots of different things you can do with it, but the US has been particularly slow at finding a permanent repository or permanent solution for spent nuclear fuel. And this failure has strengthened opposition to the technology. So you see lots of states in the US have prohibitions on building new nuclear until there's some sort of solution to nuclear waste. Safety, of course, is another big concern of the public, and drives public opposition. Nuclear is relatively safe in terms of mortality impacts, especially if you compare it to fossil fuels. But even compared to something like hydro or renewables, it's relatively safe compared with how much electricity it's generated over its lifetime. Um, but as we talked about in the beginning, there are these big, well-known accidents like Fukushima, Chernobyl, that really get ingrained in the public imagination around nuclear technology. And of course, one of the first things that may come to your mind when you think of nuclear is weapons. And that leads to a lot of public opposition as well, a sort of conflation between nuclear power and nuclear weapons. And it's unfortunate that the science of nuclear fission was first introduced to most people when the US dropped atomic bombs on the Japanese during World War II. And there have been many other dark aspects of nuclear since then, particularly from the nuclear weapons complex. Like we had atmospheric weapons testing done on civilian populations, mining and contamination on indigenous lands. And, some people, particularly some pro-nuclear people, might argue, well, that's very separate from commercial nuclear power. But, for a lot of people, it's not. It's something that's really ingrained in the industry, and it's something that the industry still needs to grapple with. And there's a lot more progress than can be made on some of these legacy issues, even if they're not the fault of commercial nuclear power. It's still very important that we address them. Okay, so all of those challenges, is there a future for nuclear energy, particularly with respect to mitigating climate change? So I will say yes, but it will need to look very different, both from the technology perspective and as an industry, in the business models, in the social engagement, social license for new plants. So things are changing and things are starting to look very different. But a lot of work still needs to be done. So in the US, we have over 60 companies that are working on what we call advanced nuclear. So this is a broad term that encompasses a lot of different technologies, but they are all fundamentally different from the existing water-cooled reactors that we use around the world today. So many of them use different coolants instead of water, like gas or molten salt. Many use different fuels, and many are designed to be smaller or modular, which allows for factory fabrication. So that's making nuclear power plants in a very different way than was done in the past. So maybe some of you have heard of small modular reactors. Those can be a lot of different things, but the ones that are farthest along in commercialization look very similar technology-wise to the large reactors we have today. They're just very small, less than 100 megawatts, and will be factory produced. So produced in a different way. And a lot of these companies are promising that their reactors will be safer, cheaper, faster to build, and use fuel more sustainably. But they really need to be demonstrated first, both to gain public acceptance and to prove all of these promises. So in the last 5 years, there has been a lot of bipartisan legislation in support of advanced nuclear at the federal level. And now there are about 6 designs moving forward toward licensing and demonstration in the next few years. We can talk more about those. I will say I saw someone ask about fusion before we started. Advanced nuclear does include fusion, and there are private companies working on fusion reactors as well. And we can talk a little bit more about that. So coming to the present, there has been a lot of excitement around nuclear under the Biden administration. In the Democratic primary, Biden was one of the most supportive of nuclear energy, but he was pretty moderate on climate change, if you remember, about a year ago. So once he secured the nomination, though, he partnered with Bernie Sanders, senator from Vermont, to develop this unity task force recommendations. They did them on a bunch of issues, but a big portion of that was climate change. And this process really moved Biden to put forward the most ambitious climate plan we've ever seen from a major party. And it also explicitly includes nuclear and support for investment in nuclear innovation for these advanced designs. So Biden's plan called for 100% clean electricity by 2030 and full decarbonization of the energy system by 2050. And unlike other plans we've seen in the past, this wasn't 100% renewables, it was 100% clean electricity or carbon-free energy. And that really provides a big opportunity for advanced nuclear, particularly as a means to balance and back up increasing penetrations of variable renewables like wind and solar. So more importantly, full decarbonization, this really aggressive target for reducing emissions, will likely require electrifying a lot of sectors that currently run on fossil fuels like transportation, home heating, and industry. And this means that there will be very large demand growth for electricity in the US, but it also needs to be carbon free. So there are a lot of policy questions about what's needed to demonstrate and deploy these new nuclear technologies in a way that's equitable and sustainable. And that's a big part of the work that I do at Good Energy Collective. But there are also big questions around international collaboration and exports of nuclear technology, because there's over 30 countries around the world that are interested in starting commercial nuclear power programs. And historically, the US has played a big role with these newcomer countries, but what that looks like now could be quite different. So I'm going to stop there so we can start the conversation and hopefully get to some of your questions.
Great. Well, thanks so much for those remarks. I think that was terrific level setting, and we have so many threads to pull on there. I'm going to, I think, give our audience a little bit of a roadmap about where we're going to go with this session. I think we'll start with technology and then maybe move into some of the more social, cultural elements of nuclear, talk about some of those community aspects. And then we will swing around to policy toward the end of the presentation. So keep the questions coming. We love to see them, and we'll incorporate as many as we can. I think that one area that has been very popular with many people asking about has been thorium. And just to let the audience know what thorium is another radioactive element found abundantly in the earth. In fact, I think it's maybe even more abundant than uranium. So maybe we could talk a little bit about that technology and potential application going forward.
Yeah. So as you said, thorium is a fuel. You often hear people refer to thorium reactors. It's not a reactor technology on its own. It's a fuel that tends to make sense for certain kinds of reactors, particularly salt-cooled. So you have molten salt. That's your primary coolant. But you can also use thorium in other types of reactors, gas-cooled, and you can actually use it in existing light water reactors that we already have operating today. It provides some benefits. Some of the benefits of thorium are that it's more available, particularly in its fissile form, or in its fertile form, than uranium. And we also already have a lot of it mined. It's mined as a byproduct of rare earth elements. So we've got sort of piles of it sitting around the world. Certain countries have a lot of it, like India. So they're really interested in thorium reactors. And it has some safety benefits as well. The main benefit of salt-cooled reactors is that molten salt stays liquid at very, very high temperatures. So rather than when you use water as a coolant, which most of our reactors around the world do today, you have to keep your reactor very pressurized to keep the water liquid and prevent it from turning into steam. And keeping that pressure involves a lot of concrete, a lot of steel, and can be quite expensive. And if something goes wrong, you get too much steam, you can get a steam explosion, which is what happened at Fukushima. So with a molten salt reactor, rather than having like a pressure cooker, you have kind of a open pot of soup that can boil, but it stays liquid, and you can't really reach temperatures where it would turn into a gas. So it's much more stable to be operating at atmospheric temperatures.
Great, thank you. And you mentioned that there is there are a lot of companies right now and a lot of different experimental arms that could fall under the broad umbrella of what would be called advanced nuclear. Maybe could we describe maybe a few more of the things that are being tried? Is it a matter of changing the size and shape of the reactor design? Is it a matter of really rethinking the technology? What are some of the leaders in the clubhouse right now that are working in this area?
I think one of the big differences with a lot of the companies is that they are looking at designing products that have a market. So thinking about what the customer wants, which is generally a utility. Um, and that was not necessarily the case in the 1950s and 60s. It was more, we have this cool technology, it generates a lot of electricity, kind of a bandwagon effect where lots of utilities just wanted to build it. Now it's sort of, because we have a lot of deregulated power markets in the US, saying how can we develop a nuclear technology that actually is cost competitive with fossil fuels? And that's a challenge, but it also means you really need to innovate and think differently. So the big thing is moving towards much smaller reactors that allows for factory fabrication. So one of the companies that's pretty far ahead in terms of building their first plant is NuScale. And they're a spinout of Oregon State University. They're still located in Oregon, but they designed a very small reactor. It's 50 megawatts, but it's designed to be deployed in like 6 packs or 12 packs. So you get the benefit of factory fabrication, but then you kind of string them together into a larger unit. So you get economies of scale as well. So their goal and what they claim to be able to do is be cost competitive with natural gas. And their first plant is going to be providing electricity to Utah, particularly a group of municipal utilities, which is also a very different customer for nuclear, not the large investor-owned utility. And one of the benefits that they argued for with the regulator is that there's really not an accident that they can have where you would get release of radioactive material beyond the site boundary, so beyond the fence around the plant. So they were able to get a waiver on a certain regulation, so they can have their kind of safety planning be much smaller. Their footprint is much smaller. So that's an example of how these new designs can be, safer and maybe cheaper when you get the more factory fabrication. Because the U.S. and a lot of countries in Europe it are not so good at doing big infrastructure projects. Costs tend to go over, things get delayed. But we can be pretty good at building factory produced products, like even large things like Boeing 787 are done on an assembly line. So that's kind of the goal and what these companies are moving towards.
Do you foresee the need for either regional or national solutions for waste disposal, something that's very highly coordinated, or are we going to look at a system where every utility, every company is going to have to solve that problem on a one-off basis?
So the latter is kind of what we're doing right now, because spent fuel sits, because we don't have a federal solution, spent fuel sits at the power plant site in these dry casks. So it's not going anywhere. It's pretty stable, but we would like to move towards a more permanent solution. It probably should be federally coordinated. It doesn't need to be a single site. So under the Obama administration, there was this Blue Ribbon Commission to look again at new solutions for nuclear waste. And they recommended maybe having several regional interim storage facilities to just at least like take control of the waste by the federal government to kind of relieve utilities of that cost and liability. The utilities have been paying into this nuclear waste fund for decades to deal with waste, but they're still sort of having to manage it themselves. Other countries have made more progress on nuclear waste. So France is building a central repository, so are Sweden and Finland. But one thing that is different in the other big nuclear countries, so the countries that have a lot of nuclear besides the US are France, Japan, Russia, and growing China. China's going to surpass, well, it's already surpassed Japan right now because Japan mostly is shut down. But France and Russia and Japan all did reprocessing, so they get more energy out of that fuel before they dispose of it, and so their volume of fuel is much less, and it's also radioactive for much shorter periods of time. So it's more of a question. It's not just about, okay, we need to find a spot to put all this waste. It's what are alternatives for reprocessing, recycling the waste, getting more of that energy out. You still will need to dispose of some things in a secure way, but if you have a much smaller volume, there's maybe different solutions. So there's even some startups and companies working on innovative designs for disposing of spent fuel as well in more secure ways. And we can talk about that, but only if people are interested.
Yeah, the history of waste disposal and the technologies around it, I think, could probably be a whole separate discussion. We could probably talk for hours about that element alone. I think in the interest of covering as much ground as possible, I'd like to ask, shifting us a little bit to some of the social and cultural elements around nuclear waste disposal, and to a similar extent, the placement of reactors themselves brings up the idea of where do they go and who gets to decide where they go. This gets to the idea that policy and energy policy is often tied to power, and who gets to make decisions, and then who gets the reactor close to them. So I'm wondering if maybe we could discuss some of the ways that you've talked about nuclear reimagining itself in a more socially friendly way, in a way that it's going to become a part of a community and not just something that's dumped in people's backyards that they don't want.
Yeah, and particularly, I think nuclear was maybe a worse offender on this. Where we have nuclear at 67 sites around the U.S. right now, and these sites were chosen by the utilities, and public input was sort of an afterthought, once the plans were already going forward for construction. And that led to a lot of resistance and pushback, as you would expect if people don't feel like they were consulted, like they didn't have any power in the process. That leads to a lot of legitimate opposition. So, we want to develop a better process for siting potential new nuclear plants in a way that is more equitable, more socially just, and in particular, an aspect of it that's different with advanced nuclear is we might be dealing with much smaller plants. So we might be looking at not really large cities or suburbs of very large cities, but maybe smaller communities like municipal utilities or rural electric co-ops. And you want to really get not just public acceptance, you want to get good public buy-in. So what that is a big part of what we want to do at Good Energy Collective is develop new processes for engagement. It's much earlier. That doesn't just try to convince communities that they want nuclear, but actually looks for communities that might be really receptive to nuclear. Maybe they have a coal plant that's retiring that they want to replace. Maybe they're looking for, economic development, or they want to get in on, innovation and R&D. Or maybe they just want, a clean source of electricity that they have control and some ownership over. We want to find where those communities are and help the reactor developers do really genuine community engagement. So go to these communities, not trying to sell them on something, but saying, okay, here's what we're offering. What are all the questions you have? What are all the concerns? Which ones can we address? Maybe which ones we can't address, and we'll see if you still like the project. And we want to have communities really feel like they have the power to say no to projects. That's the ultimate goal, because it's not right for everyone. But there's plenty of places in the U.S. where nuclear make a lot of sense. Communities might be really excited about it. And so we want to find those places because we think that's a much more sustainable option and builds much stronger and lasting public support.
I'm glad you bring up the communications element of it, because I think we found that sometimes on these big, complicated science and policy questions, it's not really always just facts that will convince people. We make decisions through all kinds of means, and we have cultural values tied up in our decision making. I'm curious if you've encountered any strategies or have any success stories about really getting at the core of some of the misconceptions about nuclear and how that might influence your work going forward.
Yeah, not so much success stories to say, but one of the maybe openings is that because we haven't been building nuclear in the West for really 30 years, there is a big group of people that don't have strong opinions about nuclear. So it's very different than in the 60s and 70s when you had very vocal anti-nuclear opposition for legitimate reasons. But now there's a lot of people that don't really know what they think about nuclear. We've seen this in polling. And when nuclear is presented in more on the benefits that it can provide, sort of these new attributes, people are much more receptive to it. Um, and we've seen, even, Bernie Sanders' name was on this Unity Task Force recommendations, and Sanders has been very, very strongly anti-nuclear. But his name is on this report that says we should invest in innovative nuclear designs, particularly such that they address challenges of the technology historically. We've seen Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez say nuclear needs to be at least an option in the Green New Deal. So there's a lot of shifting perceptions around nuclear. It's not as opposed as it once was, particularly on the left, which is where you've seen the most opposition. So I think this climate change is really getting people to think differently about what's needed. And it's sort of a idea of, if you're serious about climate, you need to at least consider nuclear. Not to say we have to have nuclear, but it might be an option that's really valuable. And one success story that I will point to is for siting waste, not for siting nuclear power plants. But Sweden and Finland both had really different processes for siting their nuclear waste repository. They made it very open, and sort of Sweden asked every municipality in the country if they would be interested in hosting a nuclear waste repository, and a few of them were. And it was much more community led rather than, in the US, it was the government saying, okay, we're going to put the waste here in Nevada, deal with it. So Sweden did this sort of reverse bidding process where communities actually put forward proposals for what they would want if they were to host the repository, and then a community was chosen based on that. Finland, they did choose sites. They chose a couple sites, but then the communities really led the process of environmental impact assessment, and the communities also always had the veto to say, no, we don't want it. And they got funding to do their own studies, their own safety studies. And that's how Finland chose their waste repository and are moving forward on it. So there are these success stories around nuclear. It's not impossible to cite these things. And I think for power plants where, you have a lot more benefits, it could be a positive.
Well, I want to spend our last few minutes here talking about some of the policy and maybe previewing the decade or so ahead. We've seen in the Biden administration, which you mentioned earlier, Secretary Jennifer Granholm was recently confirmed. And I'm wondering if maybe you could give us a little bit of a preview about what you're looking for, both domestically in the US and then with any kind of international collaboration, any global action on nuclear. What are you going to be watching for?
Yeah, so I think we've seen, as I mentioned, we've seen some good bipartisan legislation in the last few years around R&D for advanced nuclear, and kind of, innovation always has bipartisan support no matter the technology, but lots sort of moving the technology, advanced nuclear forward. But now we really need to see movement on, shovels in the ground, getting these demonstration builds, getting support mechanisms for deployment, like renewables have benefited from, things like, tax credits, loan guarantees, those sorts of things, to really get projects built. And that's something that we were particularly excited about with Granholm is she really comes from a background of focusing on clean energy, innovation, economy. How do you bring jobs back to the US through advanced manufacturing? And so from reading her responses to questions about nuclear, it's clear she really gets it, but that it's going to take a lot of work to move nuclear and it really accelerate the development of this technology and the demonstration. Internationally, I think everyone who's working in nuclear recognizes that that's where the market is. I was just part of this effort with Energy for Growth Hub, where I'm a fellow, doing some mapping of the market for advanced nuclear globally. And so we were looking at where countries were, whether they're going to be, when they're going to be ready to host nuclear, and what their growth in electricity is going to be out to 2050. And it's like 90% of the growth in nuclear is outside of wealthy countries. So that's really where the market is. Now, historically, and this was a big part of my dissertation, historically, the US was the dominant exporter of nuclear technologies, particularly to these newcomer countries. And most countries start nuclear power programs by importing reactors from these well-known vendors, from France, from US, from Russia. And so that's probably going to be the case going forward. And it raises a lot of questions if the US isn't there to partner with these countries for their first projects. Right now, most of these countries have agreements already in place with Russia and China. Because they have big booming nuclear industries. So that's a big concern geopolitically. And so I think that's a secondary motivation in the US to sort of get our commercial nuclear sector going again, is wanting to do exports from that geostrategic argument that we can be partnering with countries and we'll provide partners. We'll be able to offer partnerships that have more safety and security built in, less risk of proliferation, and are just more equitable and sustainable broadly.
In the conversations that you've had with folks in this space, do you see opportunities to depoliticize the issue, or at least not have it be a polarized issue? Because, of course, so oftentimes science does get pulled into that polarization. Is nuclear an area where we could potentially see both sides really interested in coming to some kind of a solution?
Yeah, I think we've already seen depolarization, particularly around climate change and sort of the urgency of the problem, but also more people working in nuclear recognizing the challenges of nuclear. I think even 10 years ago, you had very sort of, I don't want to say like hard proponents, like nuclear is the best. We need to just build a bunch of nuclear. Whereas now there's more groups, not just Mind Good Energy Collective, but others that are saying, okay, we're probably going to need nuclear, but we also need to address the historical issues and the ongoing challenges of the technology around cost and waste, and public acceptance. And so you see more of this language in bills, like in the Biden Sanders Unity Task Force. It says we should invest in nuclear technologies that address environmental justice issues. And so it's not just a free pass, like, okay, let's build a bunch of nuclear. It's saying we will do nuclear if it can be done right. And I think that framing and that genuine intention is bringing more people, not to be sort of, pro-nuclear, but like open to starting that discussion. And I think that's been really valuable just in the last year, is seeing that openness, particularly around from younger, these more progressive climate groups. They're much more pragmatic about the solutions they're looking at to fight climate change. And for them, including nuclear is makes sense. But they also have a very strong focus on environmental justice, racial justice. And so they want to make sure that nuclear aligns with those values. And so that's the work that still needs to be done.
Well, we have so many great questions that I'm apologizing in advance for our audience. We're not going to get to here. It has been a terrific discussion so far. I wanted to leave with just an opportunity for you to tell us a little bit more about what Good Energy Collective is going to be doing in the next few years, what some of your priorities are, and then maybe how you would the optimistic case for nuclear over the next decade or so.
Yeah, so the big picture, what Good Energy Collective is doing is developing progressive nuclear policy. So that's saying, how do we need to restructure the nuclear industry so that it fits with progressive values? Because we think it does, but hasn't necessarily in the past. So um, definitely a lot more focus on community engagement and business models, policy to support nuclear deployment at a more small scale, distributed community level. And that's very different than how we've done nuclear in the past, but it needs, regulatory changes, it needs policy changes. These small communities need help financing. So we're working on figuring out the policy needs to do nuclear in this new way. And a part of our goal is to make sure that these first demonstrations of advanced nuclear are really successful. And that means finding, the right communities and developing processes that are really just and equitable. And so there's lots of different things that are included in there. One thing we think is needed is funding specifically from the Office of Nuclear Energy at Department of Energy to fund social sciences, because as we've seen, we have all this funding going towards technology R&D, which is great. We have all these exciting advanced nuclear technologies, but there's so much work that needs to be done on the social science side, and it really needs to be integrated with people who understand the technology. So getting more social scientists looking into nuclear questions, around risk perception, around public engagement, around communications, that are helping us address some of these challenges that nuclear has.
Great. Well, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. This has been such a great discussion, and I think that it's such a fascinating topic, so many complexities, so many areas to work on. We really appreciate your time and expertise.
Yeah, my pleasure. And thanks for all the good questions. And hopefully, people got their interest peaked in nuclear, and I'll keep following it.
Yeah, definitely. Well, perhaps we'll have you back on for a sequel at some point down the road, because there's so much more that we could get to. Well, thanks to our audience today. I am really appreciative of you tuning in and spending part of your afternoon with us. This recording will be available on the Institute's YouTube page. We'll put that link in the chat for you in case you want to revisit anything that we covered today, or you want to share it with a friend. You can find the Institute on Twitter at Institute SciPol. We're also on Facebook with that same handle, and we're on the web at institute.dmns.org. So on behalf of all my colleagues here at the Institute and at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, thanks again for being with us. We'll be back on April 20th for our next segment. We're going to be talking about entrepreneurship and investment in the energy space. So that should be a fun episode. So we'll hope to see you then. Until then, be safe, and we'll see you next time.